Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sharon Halpern. Welcome to our annual Yom HaShoah commemoration. This program is sponsored by Jewish for Good, the Kehillah Synagogue, Bethel Synagogue, Judea Reform Congregation, the Orthodox Kehillah at Bethel, Eitz Chaim Congregation, Chabad of Durham Chapel Hill, and Kol Haskalah. We are grateful to have Gerhard Weinberg as our speaker this afternoon. Thank you, Professor Weinberg, for joining us on Zoom from your home. Thanks go to Chad Zygan and his students at the North Carolina School of Science and Math, the Triangle Jewish Chorale, and the Yom HaShoah Group singers. Thank you to Lana Dennis of Jewish for Good, who has been instrumental in publicity and is our Zoom host. We also wish to thank Grace Little, Stephanie Stuchner, and the maintenance crew of Kehillah Synagogue. Lastly, a heartfelt thank you to our hardworking committee for the many hours of planning to execute this remembrance. Today's program is a first for us. Due to COVID-19, we are here at the Kehillah Synagogue, as well as coming to you in your homes via Zoom. We are confident that this hybrid program will come off without a problem. But if there is a glitch, please bear with us as we figure things out. To view the program, if you are joining us on Zoom, please refer to the link that Lana has posted in the chat box. We are deeply honored to have Dr. Gerhard Weinberg address us this afternoon. Henry Fuchs, a son of Holocaust survivors, a faculty member at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a longstanding member of our planning committee, was supposed to introduce our speaker, but Henry has unfortunately sustained a back injury and cannot join us this afternoon. So I will read Henry's intro of Dr. Weinberg. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Gerhard Weinberg. He was born on January 1st, 1928 in Hanover, Germany, and lived there for the first 10 years of his life. In 1938, he escaped Germany for the UK, and in 1941 came to the United States with his family. He has been a member of the UNC faculty since 1974. Professor Weinberg has been called the preeminent World War II scholar of his era. Among his many awards are the Pritzker Military Library Literature Award for Lifetime Excellence in Military Writing and the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize, a Lifetime Achievement Award given by the Society for Military History. Today, however, Professor Weinberg will talk to us not as a world-renowned scholar, but rather about his personal experiences related to the Holocaust. Professor Weinberg has also kindly agreed to answer questions informally after the end of his program. So if those interested in the sanctuary would go to the side where you will see a TV screen set up, and those people on Zoom, if you want to ask a question, please remain on Zoom. And now, with great pleasure and appreciation, let us welcome Professor Gerhard Weinberg.
No sound.
You need to unmute.
Professor Weinberg, you need to unmute yourself, please. Please unmute yourself. You are on mute. You should be able to find an icon or a symbol near the bottom of your computer screen. If you bring your cursor down to the very bottom, very slowly, of your computer screen, a tray of icons will pop up, and you should see one that says unmute. Or if the host would unmute Professor Gerhard, that would work as well.
Is this okay now?
Yes, thank you.
I'll just start over again. The family into which I was born in 1928 lived in a one-floor apartment in a 5-story apartment building my parents owned in the German city of Hanover. There were already one girl and one boy, both older than I. We belonged to what in Germany was called a Jewish Reform congregation, but in this country would most likely be considered conservative. No doubt there were comments on the subject of anti-Jewish practices and policies right after Adolf Hitler became chancellor in January 1933. But the first events that really registered with me and that I recall occurred in 1934, my father being fired from his job and my beginning grade school and being called names as a Jew. In April 1933, Hitler had ordered all Jews who held government jobs fired But the then President Paul von Hindenburg
There's no sound.
Professor Weinberg, again, you've been accidentally muted. Could you go ahead and unmute yourself? And everybody else, would you please mute your own microphones? Thank you.
Do I need to start over again?
Not
No.
completely, just the last paragraph, please.
The first events that really registered with me and that I recall occurred in 1934. My father being fired from his job and my beginning grade school and being called names as a Jew. In April 1933, Hitler had ordered all Jews who held government jobs fired. But the then president, Paul von Hindenburg, had insisted on an exemption from this policy for those who had served in the German army at the front in the Great War. My father had served on the Western and Eastern fronts, had been decorated and wounded, and had been promoted over the years from private to the cavalry equivalent of captain. He had earned a Doctor of Law degree and had been a local judge when drafted into the Prussian army in 1914. After the war, he shifted from the legal to the fiscal world, at first in an office in Upper Silesia, where he would be the last German official to turn the building of the finance office over to the Poles when the area was divided after a plebiscite. He was shifted from there to the finance office of the then Prussian province of Hanover. Immediately upon the death of Hindenburg in early August 1934, all the previously exempted Jews were fired from their positions. Thereupon, my parents converted our living room into an office for Dad and the entrance area of the apartment into a waiting room. As one who, with a law doctorate and government experience, could read and understand German legalese, a true foreign language for most people, my father could advise Jews planning and hoping to leave Germany about the meaning of the laws and regulations governing the immigration process and the implications of the laws and regulations for their property and other assets. Those who were interested could and would make appointments to see him and came to our apartment for this purpose. This process was obviously known to all of us at the time. At the age of 6, I started in the first grade of a public common school. To begin with, some of the other students would call me names. In subsequent years, some would beat me. Those who did so were especially eager to hit my nose. And as a result, I would occasionally hide between buildings for a while on my way home so that I would not upset my mother with an obviously bleeding nose. Some problems with my nose continued long after I left the country. In the gender segregated schools of the time, my sister was called names, but not beaten. My brother, a year and a half older than I, was treated so badly that my parents took him out of the local school and sent him to Berlin, where he lived in a room rented from a Jewish family while attending a Jewish school there. This meant that I had the room we shared in our apartment for myself most of the year and had to take care of his pet goldfish along with my own pet white mouse. I was instructed not to bring the mouse to the front of our apartment lest it frightened clients waiting to see my father. As a boy, I could see or hear about all manner of restrictions. Some restaurants in town had signs that stated that they would not serve Jews. I could not learn to swim because swimming pools were closed to Jews. The same thing was true for many theaters and music halls.
Yes.
For some reason, this was not the rule for zoos. So my parents bought me an annual pass to the Hanover Zoo each year. Before the family went on a summer vacation, my mother would telephone the hotel at which we planned to stay to make sure that it accepted Jewish guests. As things got worse and worse for Jews in Germany, my parents decided about 1936 that there was no future for the three of us kids growing up in Germany and that we should emigrate to the United States. I'll come to the immigration process in a moment, but should mention first that this decision led them to arrange lessons in the English language for us. There was a pair of English elderly ladies living in Hanover, and my parents paid them to introduce us to that language. I am not sure that we learned a lot, and at the time I was more interested in their pet parrot than those lessons. Since shortly after we began going to these ladies regularly, my parents decided that they too should leave for the United States. It is that process that I will now describe. In 1924, the United States had established an immigration procedure that very rigidly reduced the number of individuals who could legally come to the United States each year and allocated portions of the total to specific countries for each year. Of the approximately 150,000 to be admitted per year, 24,900 could come from Germany. Every potential immigrant was allocated what was called a quota number when he or she had qualified for entrance to the United States. And that number determined the person's sequence within the group of immigrants that would be allowed from that person's home country. Qualification included the very important requirement that there be someone in the United States who promised to support the potential immigrant for the balance of his or her life when in the United States, if that were ever necessary, and who could demonstrate the financial capacity to do this. The guarantee was called an affidavit. In our case, this requirement was met by an uncle of my mother who had left Germany for the United States under the old system late in the 19th century, and who had made a fortune as a genius in metallurgical engineering. He had been able to hold on to his fortune and to a high position in Inland Steel Corporation in the Great Depression, and in the 1930s provided the needed affidavits for dozens of his relatives in Germany, including the 5 of us. This meant that we received quota numbers and thereupon had to wait for these numbers to come up within the quota allocated to Germany. It was while we were waiting for our quota numbers to come up that the events of November 1938, called Crystal Night, occurred. While I was in school, police came to our apartment and arrested my father. They also asked about a man who had lived in another apartment in the building and learned that he had died. They were clearly operating with a list of names and addresses that had been prepared sometime earlier and took those they collected to the Hanover Central Police Station. My brother was sent home from Berlin. Mother asked the three of us what cash and unused postage stamps we had, since all Jewish bank accounts were frozen for a while. She also went to see Dad's former boss in the provincial finance office, and that official had my father released after a couple of days by the local chief of police before he was taken to a concentration camp, as most arrested Jewish men, like Dad's twin brother, were at that time. In the fall of 1938, I had moved from the public grade school to an academic middle school where there were also lessons in English. On the morning of November 14th, the principal of the school came into the homeroom of my class, in which we were all seated at our regular desks, and he read aloud the new decree expelling and banning all Jews from the public system of education. One other boy and I got up, took whatever we had there out of our desks, and left the room to go home. Being kicked out of school in the equivalent of the 5th grade was certainly a traumatic experience. At home, in the following weeks, we learned of the many new restrictions on Jews, but were most relieved that Dad had been released. The most shocking thing for me at the time was the burning of the synagogue to which we belonged and where we attended services. The German word for a house of worship of any religious community is Gottes Haus, God's house. That people could be nasty to each other was something I knew all too well, and that they could wound and kill each other, I also knew from what I'd heard about the World War. But the very idea of destroying God's house seemed to me to be in an entirely different category. The local Jewish school, which after a while I began to attend, was across the street from our synagogue, so that the sight of the ruin reminded me each day of the great horror. That process lasted only a short time, because during the 1938 winter vacation, the three of us children left Germany for England, the only country on earth that after the November pogrom deliberately opened its doors to Jewish refugees from Germany was Neville Chamberlain's England. At his insistence, the country took in about 10,000 Jewish refugee children in what was and still is referred to as the Kindertransport, the transportation of children. In addition, those who were waiting for admission to the United States or some other country and could be supported while in England could be admitted to wait there, and many thousands did so. My father could not yet get an exit permit, so my parents stayed in Germany until that issue was resolved in the spring of 1939. But the three of us kids did get exit permits and could leave much earlier because of a program initiated by the Organization of Quakers in England. They systematically asked what the British call public schools, and we would call private boarding schools, if they would take legally admitted Jewish refugee children at a reduced rate. A school for boys in the town of Swanage on the South Coast said they would take 2 boys, and a girls' school in the city of Bournemouth, also on the South Coast, said it would take 1 girl. On December 27th, I believe, our parents took us on a train to the city and port of Hamburg and put us on an American liner that was headed for New York, but would stop at Le Havre in France and then at Southampton in England on the way. On December 28, 1938, the liner left Hamburg with the 3 of us. Since this would be our chance to see a bit of France, we did go ashore and took a trolley trip in Le Havre. We had carefully saved the so-called board money that we were allowed to have and that Dad had purchased for us. We could give that to the uncle, a younger brother of our mother, when he met us at the pier in Southampton and took us by train to London. He, like the relatives we stayed with in London, was waiting for his quota number to come up and move to the United States, as he subsequently did. I was, for a few days, in the London apartment of Mother's sister and her husband. In addition to some sightseeing in the city, I was taken to my first Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, Patience, and have been a fan of Gilbert and Sullivan ever since. Early in January, my brother and I were taken by train to Swanage, where we were collected at the station by a person from the Hillcrest School, where we would spend the next year and a half. School in England was certainly very different from school in Germany. Classes had 6 to 12 students instead of 25 to 30. Classes in Latin and French were included for all, and the teachers were precise but friendly. It was then and there that I decided to become a teacher when I grew up. Well, my brother and I had to master the language and local habits and become accustomed to the food. We were not as peculiar in the perception of the approximately 30 other students attending and living there, because in those days, many British families in the British Empire sent their children to boarding schools in England. The student body at Hillcrest included 2 brothers from Kenya in West Africa, a boy from Singapore, 1 from India, 1 from Tangier in Northwest Africa, and at least 1 from Canada. The stories that the boy from India could tell about tigers and elephants were certainly more exciting than anything my brother or I could tell. A feature of the couple who owned the school that I found both interesting and most attractive was that while they insisted on a steady commitment to the Anglican form of Christianity, with religious services held regularly in the school, and the students all going together to church on Sunday, they arranged for my brother and me to hold our own Jewish Friday evening service every week. In the 1939 spring vacation, they took us and the boy from India with them to a farm that they owned in Wales. This was certainly a most generous gesture and one that we really appreciated. When the war started, In the fall of 1939, we students were all given knitting needles and instructed on how to knit woolen squares that would be joined into scarves for British soldiers. In the evening, we would all sit in the large office of Mr. Lloyd, the owner and principal, and knit while he read to us from the New Testament. We would each get up in a sequence determined by age after petting their dog who had gone from one kid to another. It would be difficult to conceive of a more gracious form of education, and I have nothing but fond memories of such occasions as producing laughter by fellow students when in conversation at mealtime, I used a Latin or French word instead of English by mistake. In May 1940, as the German army crushed the French and British armies in Western Europe, German air raids started, and we all spent lots of time in the school's shelter. A huge bomb dropped into the school's garden and fortunately did not explode or I wouldn't be here. Some of the kids were betting on which day of the week the German invasion of England would start. The headmaster gave each of the two male teachers one of his extra hunting rifles with the comment one often heard in England in those days: "You can always take one with you." Our father was interned as an enemy alien, and our mother and sister had to leave the coastal town of Bournemouth and thus came to live with family members in London. In mid-July, we were informed that our quota numbers for the United States were about to come up. So my brother and I left the school in Swanage and also moved to London so that we could be processed at the American Embassy. In practice, this meant that I was in London during the first part of what was called the Blitz, the heavy bombing of London. Again, that meant a lot of time in the basement of the apartment building where my aunt and uncle lived. It also meant walking through the nearby parks and watching the crews of the barrage balloons, crews that, to my surprise, included some made up of uniformed women. I looked up and could tell that the balloon did not seem to care whether it was controlled by male or female crew, a lesson of importance for me. In early August, we were processed at the American Embassy. Not long after, a group of adult refugee men who had all been interned on the Isle of Man between England and Ireland were brought by bus to London to be processed as well. And we stood in the middle of Grosvenor Square to wave to Dad, as did the relatives of other interned refugees. One lady and her daughter, whom we met there, turned out to be also being brought to the United States by mother's uncle, because their husband, Dad, had been the one other Jewish soldier in the Prussian conscript army he had served in back in the late 19th century. At the end of August 1940, we were informed that we needed to get on a train for an overnight trip to Glasgow on the northern coast of Scotland, where there was a ship, the Cameronia, that would take us to New York. We got on the train during an air raid, and the last passenger wagon of the train was filled with the male refugees who had been interned, processed, and were now to be released. After the overnight trip, we disembarked in Glasgow near the ship. The families were thereupon reunited, and we all exchanged our gas masks that we'd been carrying for life belts as we entered the Cameronia and went to the cabins that had been assigned to us for the trip. There was a 10-day trip from September 1st, 10th, as the Cameronia zigzagged across the Atlantic by itself, not in a convoy. The ship waited a night outside New York City Harbor, and that gave all the passengers a chance to marvel at the city's lights, since the United States was not at war, and we had all become accustomed to the blackout in England for a year. After being processed and united with our luggage, we were collected by relatives at the pier. The 5 of us were temporarily visitors in the home of an older brother of mother who had moved to the United States in the 1920s, had married and was settled with his wife and children in a house in Scarsdale, a suburb of New York City. There, the 3 of us kids attended Scarsdale High School for some weeks while our parents decided where to settle. They looked over some places, with our mother driving a borrowed car because Dad's World War I arm wound kept him from driving. They decided that Albany, New York was the place for us. And in early December 1940, we moved into a house they rented there, and into which we subsequently unloaded the furniture they had sent from Hanover before the war and that had been in storage in New York in the intervening year and a half. I was originally assigned to a grade school's 8th grade, but after a week or so was skipped a year into the middle of the 9th grade in Philip Livingston Junior High. Dad looked for and found an accounting job, and Mother worked on weekends in a downtown department store. All 3 of us kids had part-time jobs after school and on weekends, with half of what we earned going to help support the family and half being our allowance. My parents were also receiving monthly checks from Mother's uncle and a couple of other members of her family. The most important change in our lives came in the spring of 1941, when the quota number of Dad's mother came up. She went by train from her home in Germany, across then German-occupied France, and across Spain into Portugal to board a ship, the Nyassa in Lisbon, for her trip across the Atlantic Ocean to New York. One of my responsibilities thereafter was to teach her some English. She lived with us for the balance of her life. In Albany, we were welcomed by Beth Emeth Reformed Congregation, where we attended services, and I went to Sunday school, was subsequently confirmed, and came to be a Sunday school teacher myself. Our grandmother, and in later years, both my parents, were buried in the congregation cemetery. In our early years of attendance, we at times pleasantly noted the appearance of New York State's Governor, Herbert Lehman, at the religious service. Today, my brother is a long-time member again, after some years away in the Army and positions elsewhere. My having skipped a grade meant that I attended the 9th grade for half a year and then moved to Albany Senior High School. When the United States was forced into the war by Japan, Germany, and Italy, both in American high schools and in colleges, arrangements were developed that enabled youngsters to get as far as possible in their education before reaching draft age. In January 1944, right after my 16th birthday, I graduated from high school and entered what was then New York State College for Teachers, and is now the New York State University at Albany. Taking advantage of those special arrangements of high-level course enrollments and special summer sessions, I was able to finish the third year of college by my 18th birthday in 1946, in spite of part-time jobs to earn money. In those days, that meant being drafted while I was legally, quote, stateless, formerly German. After basic training in Fort Polk, Louisiana, and a short stay in Camp Stoneman, California, I spent the rest of my military service in Japan. That was a most interesting experience. First in emergency supply at the 4th Replacement Depot in Zama, and most of the time teaching American soldiers in the Yokohama Army Education Program School. There was my opportunity to teach American history, American government, and also some literacy classes. On weekends, another soldier teaching at the school and I did a lot of sightseeing in the central portion of Japan. In early 1947, the American Army noticed that it had enough volunteers and decided to honorably discharge all of its draftees. It did not draw in draftees again until the Korean War in 1950 and thereafter. This meant that I was in the Army a bit over a year instead of the expected 3 or 4 years. I returned to Albany State Teachers College, finished a BA there, took some graduate work before moving to the University of Chicago, where I took my MA in history in 1949 and a PhD in 1951, greatly helped by the GI Bill of Rights and some part-time employment. It was while a graduate student in Chicago that I became an American citizen. I'll be very brief in covering the academic career that followed. I worked for 3 years on captured German documents in the War Documentation Project in Alexandria, Virginia, where a soldier also working there showed me the arrest list of November 1938 with my father's name on it. Thereafter, I filled in for 1 year at the University of Chicago, taught for 3 years at the University of Kentucky, established and ran for a year and helped subsequent summers the American Historical Association project of microfilming the captured German documents before their return to Germany, and then taught 15 years at the University of Michigan, followed by 25 years at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. During those years, there was also the chance to be a visiting professor for a while at the University of Oregon, the United States Air Force Academy, and Bonn University in Germany. 1999 looked like a good year to stop full-time work. The first candle will now be lit in memory of Horst Judenberg, my very best friend, and 2 distant elderly relatives of my father who lived not that far from Hanover, all 3 having been killed in 1942. Thank you.
A warm welcome to the students of the North Carolina School of Science and Math and their director, Chad Zigan. They will perform Vuahin Zolach Gain. Our second candle will be lit by Darius Scheinert. Darius is a 3G, a third generation survivor.
Hi, my name is Darius. Some of you may know me as Antek Scheinert, and I'm a board member of Jewish Renewal in Poland. Each Yom HaShoah, I recognize that fortunate events led to the survival of my grandparents during the occupation of Poland, leading them to meet each other and then permitting to allow me to be born in Poland. While my daughter's birth in 2019 ensured the continuity of my grandparents' heritage and family tree, not all of my ancestors were lucky enough to see their offsprings be fruitful and multiply. I light this candle in memory of my great aunt, Hannah Schwartzberg, her son, who was 2 years old, Israel, her husband, her parents, and her best friend, who were all murdered by the Nazis. And also for all of the Polish Jews who perished during the Holocaust, having no one living left to remember them.
Our third candle will be lit by Lois Ballin, a refugee activist and advocate.
I light this candle in recognition and honor of the millions of refugees worldwide who have been displaced, who had to leave because of danger, looking for a safe place to live. With a team of 10 people as a welcome circle with Judea Reform and HIAS, I'm currently resettling a refugee family of 4 from Afghanistan as they begin a new life in Durham. I see firsthand the obstacles they face on a day-to-day basis, such as missing their former life and the professional jobs they left as they now look here for service jobs. I also see firsthand the hope they have in their eyes and hearts for a future filled with opportunity, safety, and freedom, such as when their children return home from school with excitement about what they've learned and the new friends they've made. The complexities of refugee resettlement at times feel overwhelming for me, but we in the United States have a charge, a responsibility to help those seeking a safe haven. As we just read in the Haggadah, we know the heart of the stranger because we were strangers in Egypt. So we are called to help today's strangers resettle, to help adjust to a new society with a maze of customs, skills, jobs, schools, and more. Not so different from the refugees who wanted desperately to come to these shores before and during the Holocaust.
The song you just heard, Wir sind ganz junge Bäumchen, was sung by the Yom HaShoah a cappella group. The German song was first performed in 1941 at the Gurs internment camp in southern France. Its composer, Alfred Kahn, taught the song to a group of Jewish children who had been deported to Gurs along with their parents from southwestern Germany. The lyrics by Leopold Rauch compare the children to young trees or saplings that have been torn violently from the ground and now need a safe, peaceful home where they can put down roots. Candle number 4 will be lit by Andrew Geller, a 2G, a second generation survivor.
Before the war, my mother, Stella, who is very much still alive, her parents, Herschel and Perla Goldberg, and her Aunt Rouge were French citizens in Paris. In July 1942, during the Nazi occupation of France, my mother's Aunt Rouge was deported in the Velodrome d'Hiver, the Veldiv incident. My mother hid with her parents many times in many places, in their own apartment, in the homes of neighbors and employers, and finally, Stella was hidden by OSI, Ouvre Secours les Enfants, the French underground. The last time Stella saw her parents was in September 1942 at age 7 as she boarded a train for Arroux outside of Paris, where she spent the war fostered by a family with an identity she invented for herself. Her parents were deported to Auschwitz and died there in January 1943. In 1946, Stella boarded a ship and sailed to the United States. I light this candle in honor of my mother and in memory of her parents and her aunt and those who acted bravely to help them.
Candle number 5 will be lit by Adam Rosenblatt, a 3G, a third generation survivor. Adam is not able to be here today, so Beth Berman will read his remarks.
I am the grandson of 3 Holocaust survivors. Since we don't have time now for their individual stories, I'll just tell you that between 1941 and 1945, these 3 people collectively experienced the ghettos of Lodz and Radom and the concentration camps of Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, Dora Nordhausen, Mauthausen, and Bergen-Belsen. In 1945, they emerged from the camps to learn that most of the people they love were dead. My grandparents never found their dead. Virtually no one killed in the Holocaust has a marked grave. In my academic field, erasing the dead means preventing people from knowing where their dead loved ones are or what exactly happened to them. Erasing a dead person extends the violence inflicted on that person in life. It's often done simply by tossing a body like a piece of garbage into a mass grave. But erasure can happen in other ways too. We ourselves live amid unmarked graves of Indigenous people and atop unknown burial sites of the enslaved. The desert near our southern border has become a vast, unvisited cemetery of anonymous migrants. I hope that we will eventually decide to protect and honor all of these precarious grave sites and make them part of our public history. I don't know if it matters to the dead, but it matters to their living descendants and to anyone wishing to understand the fullness of our past. As a beneficiary of their endurance and the love they found within themselves, I light this candle in memory of my grandparents, Arthur Rosenblatt, David Bialer, and Genya Strasbourg. In memory of David Bialer's first wife, Bella, and his daughter, Mira. In memory of my grandmother's sister, niece, nephew, and cousins. And in memory of all the ones whose names I know and those whose names I don't.
Candle number 6 will be lit by Steve Goldberg, a dedicated teacher of the Holocaust.
When I first met Holocaust survivor Abe Piasek, he had just turned 90. And I think it's fair to say that he was at the height of his charm and his ability to connect with an audience. It feels odd to say this, but he was only 90 years old. He came across as much younger, full of zest. I hope to be like Abe when I'm older. In the last decade of his life, Abe shared his story with with hundreds of audiences throughout North Carolina, mainly schools, but also military bases, churches, community centers, and libraries. I had the honor to interview Abe nearly 10 times. I learned his story and we became friends. 3 days before he passed away, Abe asked me to keep telling his story. I've spent the past 2 years doing that. When I share Abe's story, I weave together a dozen video clips of Abe speaking, which means I get to hear Abe's voice on a regular basis. The central message that Abe had for his audience was don't hate. That message had particular poignancy because of who Abe was and what he went through. He also encouraged students to stand up to bullies. If you see someone doing that, do something, speak up. That's what Abe said when students hugged him, as they inevitably did, to thank him for speaking and asked him for advice. Abe was born in Poland in 1928, the same year as our distinguished speaker. When he was 11, Germany invaded and Abe saw his small town turned into a ghetto. And at age 12, Abe saw his friend shot at point blank range because he was a Jew caught outside of the ghetto. At age 13, Abe was taken from his family to work in a slave labor camp from 1942 to 44. A month after Abe was taken from his home, the ghetto was liquidated. His mother, father, and little sister were almost certainly sent to Treblinka, where they were murdered. Abe toiled in 2 more slave labor camps in Germany before he was liberated from a cattle car just outside of Dachau in April of 1945. You'd think the Holocaust would be a depressing topic, and it is. It's a devastating in its scope and its industrialized evil. But each time I share Abe's story, and I've now shared it more than 65 times, I find myself newly inspired by Abe's positive attitude and zest for life. I light this candle in Abe's memory and in the memory of his family.
Now, I would like to invite you to participate in the community candle lighting ceremony. Please come forward and light a candle in memory of a loved one.
conclude our commemoration today with a recitation of El Malei Rachamim and Kaddish by Rabbi Jen Feldman.
El Malei Rachamim Shochein Bamromim Hametzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechina B'malot Kedoshim Utehorim Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim Lenishmot 6,000,000 Achenu v'Achiotenu שמתו על קידוש השם, ינוחו בשלווה ובשלום שלא ידעו בחייהם. אנא בעל הרחמים, הסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר אמן. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחיי חון ובימי חון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם עולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דאמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Please join us in the singing of Zognit Kein Mol. For those of us in the synagogue, the lyrics are in your program. If you are at home on Zoom, the lyrics will be provided on your screen. Please keep yourself muted as it is difficult to coordinate the audio. This concludes our community Yom HaShoah commemoration. If you wish to ask Dr. Weinberg a question and you're at home, please remain on Zoom. If you're in the sanctuary, please come to the side of the sanctuary near the television screen. We're going to break for about 5 minutes and we'll reconvene as soon as it's a little bit quieter in the hall. Goodbye, everyone. Stay well and healthy.